of monetized deficit and the efficacy of identifying new sources of financing deficit to move ahead with the capital infrastructure programs, because we know that we have a fiscal rule on board. So we cannot spend just like that. We have to keep everything, to 3% of GDP. But against the COVID pandemic context, there is a rethinking. Of course, it's global rethinking, that should we be following these fiscal rules of strict 3% of GDP, our fiscal deficit, because this time what is more relevant is spending. We need to spend on many categories to have our economic recovery. So if we have a strict fiscal rule and a strict fiscal policy and with a deficit to 3% of GDP, then that will have growth consequences, adverse growth consequences, and we won't be able to, meet the humanitarian considerations at this moment. So that's the backdrop in which there is a rethinking about not only levels of fiscal deficit, but also how we are going to finance the fiscal deficit. So that is the context. So when I talk about the re-emergence of monetized deficit, I thought that I will take you through the measurement issues. Earlier, if you remember, in your childhood or in my childhood, there was just only one concept of deficit in India. That was deficit financing. That is, we print money and finance the deficits. So in that process, finance ministry was always getting the first mover advantage, and the monetary policy maker follows the fiscal policy. So here the fiscal dominance was operating with a kind of, print money and finance the deficits. But it is not exactly print money and giving. It is happening through a kind of ad hoc treasury bills. We had 14 days treasury bills with a cap interest rate of 4.5, and we used that ad hoc treasury bills to finance the deficit to a huge extent. But over the years, we controlled the monetization of deficit because it was very inflationary. You can understand that. So I will take you through that process of why we have changed from the mode of financing of deficit from monetization to bond financing. Now everything is market determined through market borrowing, right? After that, I will take you through the macroeconomic impact of deficit, because that's why the investors' confidence, the credit rating agencies are all, following us, like what is our macroeconomic fundamentals. And one of the important or crucial macroeconomic fundamentals is your fiscal deficit. So we need to keep it constant. Otherwise, the investors' confidence will suffer. Credit rating agency and the foreign capital, they all will have a rethinking whether Indian economy is doing good. So that's why for that signaling effect, we need to keep the fiscal deficit in control. Any other macroeconomic consequences we need to unpack and see, or whether we should be doing all these things just to keep that 3% of GDP or fiscal deficit to please the credit rating agencies at the cost of capital formation in our economy. I will take you through those kind of public finance debates in this lecture. Then, finally, I will open up the consequences of fiscal monetary policy linkages and lack of it, and also the crowding out debate. So here, let me begin with a statement. You can agree with me or not, but let me begin with a statement that high public debt or high fiscal deficit has no fiscal cost if the rate of interest in real terms is not greater than the real growth of your economy. Because here real growth of economy means you are measuring in terms of your GDP, and you have the GDP numbers on board, a few weeks back we got. So if the rate of interest, if you look at in the real terms, what is real rate of interest? Your nominal rate of interest minus inflation. So you look at these two macroeconomic variables, these two parameters, and if you find your R is greater than G, that is detrimental for your economy. But if R is not greater than G, it's a kind of free lunch, then you can go ahead with little bit of monetization of deficit or a little bit of bond financing of deficit. When the R is greater than G, then bond financing of deficit may not be feasible and you have to eventually monetize your deficit. So I will explain to you in detail. We will revisit this point later. So why high fiscal deficit? In the Union Budget 2021, Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman, our finance minister, has pointed out that deficit is good, or don't fear deficit, in the time of pandemic, and she floated a very high fiscal deficit number of 9.5% of GDP. Can you imagine this? Our deficit shooting up to 9.5% of GDP. But of course, this is not due to the program formulation or the designing the programs or spending to tackle the pandemic. When you decompose this 9.5% fiscal deficit GDP ratio, you can also understand that it is due to the revenue uncertainties and also due to the strengthening of budget transparency. And I will take you through that budget transparency also little later. Before that, let me introduce you a term, output gap. So we have to take our narrative of high fiscal deficit or high debt to GDP in terms of reducing output gap. So output gap is the difference between your potential output and the actual output. And actual output, as I mentioned, is your GDP number, and potential output is your what is the potential or aspirational level of a growth process in an economy. So usually what we do is, in RBI, in Ministry of Finance, what they do is they take the GDP series, and this GDP series has two important components. One is cyclicality, that's the ups and downs. You take out that. Then another component is the overall trend. And this trend is treated as your potential GDP. But of course, this is a controversial concept that, whether the trend GDP, that data-driven GDP, is your potential GDP or it's a kind of an envelope we need to formulate. But Ministry of Finance and RBI, they use certain econometric methodology to arrive at the potential output. So that's it. But it is highly controversial, and the economists mention that there is no silver bullet to arrive at a reliable, output. And especially in terms of, uncertainties and macroeconomic uncertainties, we have to measure economic slack. And usually economic slack is measured by this difference between actual and potential gap or potential GDP. So that's the way it is. But we have seen from the global financial crisis of 2007 that no economic recession is followed by a quick economic rebound. So what we articulate as V-shaped or Q-shaped recovery, that can happen only if the fiscal stimulus packages or the fiscal dominance or the fiscal support will continue, not a quick rebound or a rollback of stimulus packages this moment to control the deficits, because that will be detrimental to the growth process. That's why, we have a very high fiscal deficit to GDP number of 9.5% of GDP. So you can take a look at my work, that 2021, Chakraborty 2021, that reference is my article on the macro framework of the Union Budget 2021, and that is published in EPW. If you're interested, you can take a look into these arguments and the empirical numbers. I use the Union Budget 2021 to articulate these statements. And the point is, the overall GDP, that downturn may not be cyclical. It may be a permanent scar. If it is a permanent scar, we need to focus on, the concept of the structural elements along with, the what you call as cyclical elements. That's why in the stimulus packages we have floated two components. One was a kind of economic firefighting package to tackle with the cyclicality elements, and the other is we use this crisis as an opportunity to float certain structural reforms in terms of your labor market reforms. And we also have twin balance sheet problem, right? We have corporate debt issue and we have balance sheet of the banks issue. So NPA is mounting. So we need to do a twin balance sheet cleaning up process. So therefore, banking reforms are crucial. Then also our power sector. That's one of the important area which we need to look into. And we have a study in NIPFP looking into the efficacy of having this financial and operational parameters in the power sector, especially in the context of Uday. We have used the data from the Uday dashboard that is published by Ministry of Power. We have taken a look into those data. The financial indicators include the tariff revisions, because tariff revisions are very essential, from the perspective of finance. And the power sectors, we have produced the kind of electricity which is required to have 100% electrification of our villages. But what is the problem in between? Why we are not able to do that perfectly? Because the distribution companies are not doing their job. They are in losses. So now, even if the production is okay, we have to focus on the distribution companies, and we have to take them on board for their function to be perfect. So what we have done is we have tried to take their losses to the state finances, the state government finances. The state finances own the process. In that process, what happened is that the state finances deteriorated. But have we achieved anything in this process in terms of financial and operational parameters to be all right of this discoms? That question is very relevant. That is why now in the nudging process by the government of India in the financing deficit issues, government of India is nudging the state governments to go ahead with some performance-led indicators to get the extra borrowing power. So the extra borrowing power, it's also linked to the performance of your power sector. And in terms of your financial indicators, as I mentioned, tariff revision is one of the important indicators. And the second one is the difference between your average or the aggregate cost and your revenue. And if this is not neutralized or nullified, then you are getting into loss-making enterprises. So you have to reduce your cost revenue gap. And third is your aggregate technical and commercial loss. And you understand that the technical issues can be corrected if you go for the operational parameters like smart meters, many things, and the other kind of losses, even the theft that happens in the power sector, then we should have a segregation of the grids to the commercial and to the household. So all these processes where India is or where Indian states are, the picture is not great. We have to take a look into these indicators in the dashboard of the Ministry of Power. There was a tripartite agreement between Ministry of Power, discom companies and the state governments to go ahead with the power sector reforms. And in the recent budget, we announced that we are going to privatize the discoms or the power distribution companies. But the story about your financial and operational parameters in the power sector, they are not great. But of course the picture is mixed. Some of the states are doing very well, some of the states are not. And I will give this paper on power sector reforms written by me, my colleague Amandeep Kaur and Divi Renkan in our institute in NIPFP. I will forward this paper to Dr. Periswamy, and he can circulate that paper with you, and you can take a look at the graphs which we have done to analyze state-wise indicators for financial and operational parameters. So that's it. Now coming to the budget transparency. I mentioned that 9.5% of your fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, that is not entirely the new expenditure prerogatives or the new expenditure imperatives of the center government. It is also a mixture of revenue uncertainties in the time of pandemic and budget transparency. That's what I mentioned. And what exactly is this budget transparency? There are several components of budget which are not part of your fiscal deficit. Why it is so? By definition of fiscal deficit, you don't need to show certain components of the deficit you take through the public sector enterprises and also through the corporate bodies. So those components you need not show up in your fiscal deficit. By definition, your fiscal deficit is a net borrowing requirement of your state or the center government, and the components of the deficit you take through public sector enterprises, just like the way Kerala government has done. They have gone to London market to take the masala bonds, and that happened through a public sector entity called NIPFP. So what they have done is, it's not exactly the government, but of course state government guarantee was there. And there was a lot of arguments regarding this. It was a political economic question in the context of Kerala. One, why we have gone to external markets to finance the deficit. Two, why this is not there in the fiscal deficit in the budget documents, why it is non-transparent. And the answer to these questions, one, of course, it is not in the budget documents and the estimates, because this kind of deficit which we incur through off-budget borrowings, even by the center government, is a trend, and they keep it as annexure in the union budget documents. It is not a part of fiscal deficit by definition. That's why the numbers were not included in fiscal deficit. Second, external financing is okay or not. You have to get the sanction of RBI to go ahead with the London market financing of deficit to get the masala bonds. So RBI has given sanction to Kerala government to go ahead with that. But the question is, check the interest rates. The interest rates are very high. But then, the way Kerala government has defended then was that when you compare the rupee denominated bonds and dollar denominated bonds, rupee denominated bonds are better, and masala bond is a rupee denominated bond. So then you don't have to work with your exchange rate fluctuations or exchange rate elements over there, which can even further shoot up the interest rate. But this interest rate is okay the moment you compare with the dollar denominated interest rates. Fine. Then comes the question, what about the maturity structure of your debt market? Have you seen the RBI recent table on the structure of bond market across state governments in India? Telangana, if you look at the structure of maturity of the bond market, you can see that they have gone for an elongation of the maturity structure. Why they have done that? As it was a new state, high growth trajectory was their concern. So what they have done, they have kept a very high growth trajectory, and they have taken up the bonds which are long term in nature. So they shift their the refinancing risk to future to over 40 years. So that's why, government of India and RBI, all of us, we engage in this kind of elongation of maturity structure. And I am a member of this recent 5-year plan. You can understand that it's only in Kerala you have a 5-year plan, and the 14th 5-year plan is on, and I'm a member of that committee which looks into the resource requirements and the revenue mobilization. So one of the concerns in Kerala also regarding the debt sustainability. So we have to look into that in the course of the meetings. And when it comes to the debt sustainability, theoretically, R should not be greater than G. If the R is greater than G, then you are in trouble. And I understand that Professor Shanmugam, the director of MSc, has a lecture for you on, the debt sustainability. So he will be speaking to you in detail about it, the conceptual and the empirical part. So I'm not getting into that in detail, but all what I want to highlight is, it is not the numerical threshold of 30% or 40% of your GDP should be the public debt. It is how you tackle your R and G. That is the real rate of interest and the real growth of economy. Now, the question, what is the ideal measure of deficit? Of course, it is not fiscal deficit, because in terms of coverage, the deficit that you incurred through the public sector entities and the corporate bodies are not covered in fiscal deficit. So what could be an ideal fiscal deficit or the ideal deficit concept in terms of coverage? That is public sector borrowing requirement, PSBR. But in India, due to the paucity of data on intra-public sector transactions or the intersectoral linkages within the public sector, we have to delineate that. In order to do this exercise, we have to know that intra-public sector transactions and the deficit details at the third tier. It's a general government data which we need to handle the moment we talk about PSBR. So the data is not ready, and that's why we don't have a consistent time series data on PSBR. But the moment central government decides or the union government decides on having PSBR as the concept of deficit for India, then of course this budget transparency will be clear, because we need to incorporate then all the components into the deficit concept. Right now, we keep our fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP, but we go for off-budget borrowings, that innovative sources of financing, especially to finance, capital infrastructure. Now, as I mentioned, traditionally, up to the late 80s, I mentioned in our childhood, there was only one concept of deficit. That was financing the deficit through ad hoc treasury bills. And that was the prime objective of the fiscal management, how to contain your budget deficit, because it was inflationary in nature. And you can take a look at the IMF pioneering surveys of this evolution from, the single deficit to purpose-specific series of deficit concepts. And why it has happened like that? Even the budget deficit was not capturing the entire monetization of deficit, because budget deficit, which was done through the treasury bills, the 14 days treasury bills, was a part of monetization of deficit. So monetization of deficit was a wider concept than just the part of your ways and means advances right now, because after containing this budget deficit, what we call this concept in the recent budgets as ways and means advances. So that is the withdrawal of cash balances from RBI. That's for the transitory thing, for your cash management purposes. And we control that because the reserve money in our economy was going up. And the reserve money, two important components to it. One is the foreign exchange reserve of our country, and the second is what is the net RBI credit to the government of India. So net RBI credit to the government of India was the monetary deficit, and we control that. And in that process, one component of the high-powered money was controlled, but overall high-powered money which we could not control because the foreign exchange reserves were shooting up that time and even now. So just imagine if had it been the case that your net RBI credit to the government and foreign exchange, both components shooting up, then your high-powered money would have been further increased, and that led to inflationary pressures in the economy. So that's why there was a committee called Chakraborty committee which looked into these aspects and controlled monetization of deficit. That's why now, against the backdrop of pandemic, there is a debate by Kotak Mahindra, the industrial giant, and even our Nobel laureates, Professor Abhijit Banerjee, and of course Professor Kaushik Basu, our chief economic advisor, former chief economic advisor. There was a debate that all of them wanted India to go ahead with monetized deficit, because these are times and uncertainties, extraordinary times, and we need money to tackle the crisis. Once we survive the crisis, later on we can think about, controlling deficits. But right now, if we control the deficits at the cost of economic recovery and addressing the livelihood concerns, we won't be getting the economic recovery correct. So that's why they engaged in a debate that go for monetization of deficit. But you must have noted the interview by our director, Professor Pinaki Chakraborty, to Press Trust of India, and it was carried in almost all economic dailies. If you look at the Business Standard or Financial Express of Mint, you can understand that his point, don't go for monetization of deficit this moment. He cautioned it because, one, of course, India has not reached a level in which our R is greater than G. Second, whether that will lead to a fiscal profligacy or whether it will open the floodgate of monetization of deficit. And once again, this fiscal dominance, the fiscal policy makers getting the first advantage, that is going to be detrimental in terms of your inflation in the economy. So that was the concern. But of course, he mentioned that if your R is greater than G, as the last resort, you can go for monetization. But we now need to look into the other sources of revenue mobilization, or we also have to deal with the debt deficit dynamics to deal with the pandemic concerns or the pandemic economics. So that's why I mentioned that monetized deficit, once relevant in our economy prior to the late 90s, is now getting an importance right now. But we have already traveled far from shifting the financing pattern of deficit from seigniorage financing, that is monetization of deficit, to bond financing. So that's why fiscal deficit is a concept which incorporates these processes of monetized deficit along with the other borrowing requirements. So it's borrowing means it's not only an RBI component, it is broader than RBI. We have the bond market. So this fiscal deficit captures the entirety, all those things except the borrowings that are happening through the public sector enterprises, in which we have to use PSBR in terms of coverage. So fiscal deficit is defined as a difference between your non-debt creating receipts and the total government expenditure devoid of the repayment, because that is only the non-debt creating capital receipts which we are including into the gross fiscal deficit. So it's the revenue expenditure plus capital outlay. It's not capital expenditure, capital outlay plus net lending. Then you have to deduct your revenue receipts plus non-debt creating capital receipts. So that's how you get your fiscal deficit. Now, there was an argument in the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Committee, which was recently, that's in 2018, we had a committee, right? And Arvind Subramaniam then was a chief economic advisor. He was also a part of it, and it was chaired by Dr. N.K. Singh, who was the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. And do you remember that debate happened between the members of FRBM committee? Arvind Subramaniam stood for primary deficit as the operational parameter of the government. You know why? Primary deficit reflects the current fiscal stance. It is not incorporating the past liabilities of the government or the past indebtedness of the government through interest payments. Fiscal deficit minus interest payments is primary deficit. So what he argued, and he even went ahead with writing a dissent note. You can take a look into the FRBM committee in the annexure or in the appendix. The dissent note by Arvind Subramaniam is there because he believed primary deficit as the operational parameter of the government, fiscal parameter of the government. When the other committee members, including the chairman, N.K. Singh, believed that we have to continue with fiscal deficit as the operational parameter of government, of India and the state governments. So in that tug of war, what we have done is, if you look at the recent budget also, you can feel that fiscal deficit is the operational parameter of government. We have not switched to primary deficit. But what is the merit of that argument? Why primary deficit has to be given importance? And what is the plausibility that it can be the operational parameter of the government in terms of the fiscal stance? Because a rate of interest is exogenous. It's not with the Ministry of Finance. So when the rate of interest is exogenous, you can be out of it. And second, you focus on your current fiscal stance, not on the past liabilities. So primary deficit is an indicator to assess the impact of the current discretionary fiscal action on the indebtedness of the government. So that's why it was relevant. But in that tug of war, Arvind Subramaniam's point, of course it was given respect, but we went ahead with fiscal deficit. One moment. Okay, now there is a golden principle in the FRBM committee report. In the sense, we floated our first fiscal rule in 2004, and of course all the state governments have their fiscal responsibility legislations, and the focus on revenue deficit, that's what is the golden principle. The golden principle is that whatever the central government or the state governments earn through the revenue receipts, use that receipts for your revenue spending. And if you look at the gap between the revenue spending and revenue receipts, that gap should be zero. That's a golden principle, because what you earn, use it for your recurring spending. That means whatever you borrow, that will entirely go for the capital formation or capital infrastructure, public investment purposes. That's the narrative. But later on in 2018, if you look at the financial bill, certain clauses related to this amendment of FRBM you can see, and take a look into that clauses, and I have written about it, and that is again in the article in EPW, and escape clause, different things are there to it. And if you look at that clauses, revenue balance is deleted from the amendment of the FRBM Act. So if you look at the amendment, there is no concept of a revenue balance, or there is no emphasis on this golden principle or revenue deficit. But right now, there is a re-emergence of this importance of the revenue deficit. But of course, if you look at the central government numbers in the 2021 budget, of course it's not zero, and it is even 3.4 around that. But of course, I do believe that we can live with revenue deficit this moment, because we cannot control revenue expenditure, because we need to spend on health, we need to spend on education, which we have to tackle the digital divide, we have to vaccinate the people, we have to strengthen the physical infrastructure and also the social infrastructure in terms of the health infrastructure, health professionals. So we have to focus on these things, and we cannot say revenue spending or revenue expenditure is bad. We have to control it at the cost of these health sector preparedness to meet the pandemic. So let it shoot up for the moment, but we keep the roadmap ready for treating this excessive deficit procedure. That means our deficit became excessive. Of course, it is beyond the norm, the threshold norm of 3% of GDP, and the revenue deficit is not zero. That's fine. But right now, fiscal discipline cannot be fiscal or the growth enhancing. Fiscal discipline can have growth, adverse consequences on growth. So that's why the narrative government of India has taken is don't fear deficit this moment, because otherwise we will have a lot of impact on economy. Now, theoretically speaking, if you speak to economists, their take on deficit and its macroeconomic impact depends on which school of thought they belong to. And we economists are divided. When policymakers like you, when practitioners, when you talk to us, you will be able to distinguish where it is coming from, why I am talking like this. Because suppose, for example, if you talk to me, I may say that go ahead with your deficit. And if you talk to the chief economic advisor of our country, Krishna, he may tell that at this moment, in this moment we have to go ahead with high fiscal deficit. Even look at the chapter 2 of Economic Survey of India. What the narrative, Krishna and his team, our chief economic advisor and his team, has written about. You take a look on the debt sustainability chapter, that is chapter 2, and it was floated that high fiscal deficit is okay if you can substantiate that with, strengthening capital infrastructure or reduce your output gap sectorally. And this was also the viewpoint of, a famous economist, Oliver Blanchard. And, he was addressing the American Economic Association conference in Atlanta in 2019. That is prior to the pandemic, but that time there was a question of economic recession. So he was telling that these are times of economic recession. So don't believe in controlling your debt. Go ahead with high debt if you can substantiate it with that output gap reduction or your capital spending. And I was lucky to be there to present my paper in the American Economic Association conference, and I was listening to him, and his punchline in the last PowerPoint slide, what he mentioned is, if you are fearing a bad equilibrium of fiscal profligacy, you keep your fiscal rules ready, but don't use it in the times of pandemic, but use this high debt because it's a low interest rate regime. When your interest rate is lower, go for high debt and you grow out of it. Grow out of it means you get your economic recovery, you increase your GDP, you grow out of your debt. But don't say that we will not go for debt because it is like over generational debt you are creating in the economy. So the narrative is intergovernmental or generational inequity is not happening here. The moment you use your debt for capital formation and you use your debt for human capital formation and infrastructure in the economy, so then the narrative is, it is not like you're putting your future generations into debt. No, you are helping them by investing correct right now. So that's the narrative, why you have to say from the power of strength that debt is good in the times of recession and in the times of pandemic. But as I mentioned, economies are divided. We call that Keynesians, the timely deficit is good. Those who believe in Keynes. Keynes means it's like great lockdown which had economic disruption. In 1930s we had Great Depression, right? And in order to take the economies out of depression, fiscal policy was given importance, and at the cost of high debt and all, there was growth in the process and the world nations developed. So that's why we believe that Lord Keynes is correct in saying that you dig holes and put money over there. That's a way you have to recover your economy. So don't believe that deficit is bad. But neoclassicals like World Bank, IMF, of course IMF, there is a different stance now. They all believe that orthodox principle that deficit is bad. Deficit is bad because your investors' confidence will suffer. You will crowd out your private investment. Why these arguments? Where it is coming from in the neoclassical school of thought? Because they believe that in the loanable funds, your funds are limited, right? Loanable funds. From the loanable funds pool, if the government is preempting resources to finance the deficit, what is the part of funds available for private sector? The argument is $1 rise in your public investment displaces $1 private investment. That's the argument. But you can understand that it is not like that at all. Because if you use this $1 rise in the public investment, that is to invest in the infrastructure, that cannot displace, that can attract $1 increase in the private corporate investment, because infrastructure is very crucial for the economy. That's why we do believe that this moment revenue deficit is good, and this moment fiscal deficit is good, because we need to strengthen the capital infrastructure. And this policy imperatives, if you look at, one is of course the initiative of FRBM, Second, as I mentioned, the golden principle through phasing out a revenue deficit. And also I want to mention about a Ministry of Finance committee which was there on the classification of budgetary transactions. In the PPT, I have provided the link to that classification of budgetary transactions committee. This is very relevant when you look at the auditing, when you look at the accounting and the budgetary transactions and how to reclassify your revenue and capital spending. So take a look into that. It's there in the CGA web, and this is the link to that document. And that document, argues that certain component of the revenue expenditure are capital creating in nature. So we need to get into this effective revenue deficit concept by delinking those kind of components from the concept of revenue expenditure. But economists and the public policy makers, practitioners are all divided regarding the concept of effective revenue deficit. So the point is, it is not one concept of deficit. We have a lot of concepts of deficit with emphasis on fiscal deficit as the operational parameter. Okay, now, as I mentioned, there are debates, diametrically opposite views on the macroeconomic effects of deficit. And what are those public finance debates? As I mentioned, neoclassical believe that debt is bad. Keynesians believe that timely debt or deficit is good. But there is another school of thought which believes that what's the purpose of arguing like that? If whether it is debt or whether it is tax financing, it's going to have equal impact on your economy, because today's debt is tomorrow's taxes. Today's deficit is tomorrow's taxes. So it's in the intergenerational dynastic resource concept. It is pushed forward to the future generations. But I do believe that Keynesians talk little sense in terms of if your economy is in the low level of equilibrium, below potential, then you cannot say that deficit is bad, because you need to spend to trigger your economy to grow back to the pre-pandemic levels or the pre-recession levels. So right now, this moment, the mantra is deficit is good, as Nirmala Sitharaman ji pointed out. Now, as I mentioned, we control the seigniorage financing. Seigniorage is nothing but print money and financing deficit, because we feared inflationary pressures. Excessive use of any financing mode has its own, macroeconomic consequences, in the sense, if you go for the seigniorage financing, then inflation will happen. If you go for domestic debt financing, that leads to the credit skews through higher interest rates, and when the interest rates are fixed, then through the credit allocation and stringent financial repression, then crowding out of private investment and consumption can happen. These are theories, but financial repression is there in India. The moment you check your interest rates, you will be able to understand whether our country is financially repressed or not. One thumb rule is look into the real rates of interest. If your real rate of interest is not negative, then you rule out a kind of fiscal repression is there or not. But people always argue that this preemption process through the statutory liquidity ratio is another kind of financial repression. That macroeconomists can argue about it, and the opinion is inconclusive. All I want to mention is that empirical evidence shows that you crowd in your private investment if you have high fiscal deficit, and if you use it for strengthening capital infrastructure. And you can also go for your external debt, right? There are three major forms of financing deficit. One is seigniorage or monetized deficit, which there is a lot of debate over now. Second is what we are doing primarily, around 70% or 80%, or 68%, perfect answer if I have to give you. Around 68% of your entire deficit is financed through the domestic debt markets. And external financing of debt is a very insignificant component of your debt financing, and that is very good also, because then you get into this current deficit issue, current account deficit issues, and balance of payment, then your capital flight issue. All those things will come through that, because in the current account deficit, of course, we have a kind of a deficit we have for X minus M, export minus imports, but we are conveniently using the capital account to finance the current account. So the capital account, as long as Janet Yellen or the Jay Powell, the Fed Reserve chairperson, won't raise the interest rates of the US Fed Reserve, then the capital won't be flighty. But you know the taper tantrum that's happening right now, right? Taper tantrum is after the global financial crisis. It's a kind of indication from the US economy, the US Fed Reserve, is that they are going to reverse this easy monetary policy. They are going to, tighten. They are going to reduce the balance sheet of the Fed Reserve. Indirectly speaking, that will shoot up their interest rate. And hot money, by definition, respond to high interest rate. So a component of our capital account is hot money. So we fear, the emerging countries fear that our money will be flighty, our capital will be flighty the moment US interest rates are up. So what is the solution? Our monetary policy committee members, they will not rise the interest rate now, because rising interest rates will affect the economic growth process. To get the economic growth, we have to keep the interest rate lower. But if you keep the interest rate lower, your capital will be flighty. The hot money component of the capital will be flighty, because hot money always respond to the interest rate differentials, and they fly to the countries where the interest rate is high. So you need to tackle with that portfolio. Then another thing is your inflation is very high, and in this process, what RBI has taken, the decision is that they keep the status quo, the 4% repo rate, just to control, your economic growth, to trigger the economic growth. But yes, you can understand, economic growth cannot be triggered like that, because it is not one-to-one relationship, as you can understand. Because we need to have a lot of fiscal stimulus packages to support this. That's why, we are not getting into a normalization procedure of rolling back of the stimulus packages announced by RBI and Government of India, because that will have detrimental consequences now. But we are eager to do that, because in monetary policy side, if you look at the call money market rates are below the repo rate, the reference rate 4%, and your government security markets, if you look at the term structure of interest rates, that's also not great. They are going haywire. So there is a pressure to go for normalization procedures. And also, if you take a look into the 29th September, yesterday's newspaper, you can understand that the repo rate, reverse repo rate, we kept it in such a manner to nudge the commercial banks to go ahead with lending to the to their clients. But commercial banks find it easier to park back in RBI, because that's 100% safe and liquid. And we also have the evidence that the banks are putting their money above the SLR requirements, because that's a safe process. But there is a window, there is a variant of this reverse repo. If you look at, it's not 3.5, it is now close to 4%. It's like incentivizing these banks to park back in the RBI. So there is a parking back of these funds in the RBI, and that's good. And this lowering of interest rate helps the governments to go for their borrowing programs a little easier, because low interest rates are always good for the government to go ahead with more borrowing programs. But you take a look into the recent debates on this interest rate, but the moot point or the punchline is that status quo repo rate is there, that is 4%. At the same time, your CPI is going up above the comfort zone of 6%. So are we leading to a negative interest rate regime? That's a question we need to tackle. But the answer to this question is that RBI defended the elements of inflationary pressures in the economy. What you're seeing right now, they are transitory. They are supply chain disruptions. It's also due to the fickle or the volatile nature of the fuel and food prices, which will be under control soon. So these inflationary pressures are transitory in nature, and through inflationary expectations channel, RBI will be able to control the inflation. So that's the way RBI has defended this. Now, I'm not getting into this equation because I don't want to, intimidate you with an equation. All what I want to say through this equation is it is an intertemporal budget constraint. And what I have said here is you have a D, that is your deficit. Then you have CG and IG, that is consumption expenditure and investment expenditure. And that is the total expenditure. Then your T is your tax, that is non-debt creating tax. That is in a sense what I mentioned is you deduct your non-debt creating taxes or receipts from the total spending, and that's a kind of primary balance concept. And the last term in this equation is your interest payments, that is R is the interest rate and DG minus 1, that T minus 1 is your past debt. So that exactly is your interest payment. So the total fiscal deficit is your primary balance plus interest payments. That's all you have to remember, nothing else from this equation. Now, let me use this equation to ask the question how you can finance this deficit. And little bit of a rearrangement, you don't have to bother about this technical details. All what I have to tell you is that the D, that is the deficit, is financed through M, that is the seigniorage financing, to the DGP, that is the debt bond market financing, the public borrowing requirements, and E4X, that is you can run down the 4X and you can finance the deficit. That's all I want to tell. And each of these three modes of financing of deficits have got its own macroeconomic consequences. As I mentioned, this M, that is seigniorage financing, can create inflationary potential. This D, that can create the bond financing, can create crowding out or a financial crowding out through shooting up the interest rates theoretically, but we have seen that it is not happening in the Indian economy. And if you run down the 4X reserves, the kind of balance of payment crisis you have. So where is India right now? India is in the middle one, that is the bond financing. And here the re-emergence of the debate is that can we go back little to this M, that is the monetized deficit concept. That's all what I wanted to highlight using this. Can we, in the time of pandemic, can we go a little bit of leveraging the financing pattern of fiscal deficit to finite seigniorage or finite monetization, or whether it creates whether there is a probability of creating an upward pressure on inflation? So these are the questions. And as I mentioned, the public finance debates, the macro debates in public finance are mainly crowding out monetary policy, fiscal policy coordination, and the integration of the financial markets. And these elements I have talked to you, and all what I want to now highlight and stop the lecture and open the floor is you have to just look into the kind of the inflation, whether it is a monetary phenomenon. If not, that's strictly a monetary phenomenon. What are the supply side shocks? Number one. Second is, what is your fiscal policy, monetary policy coordination? And in that coordination, even the fiscal theory, I just don't want to get into theory. All what I tell is that we think that inflation or the price determination is only monetary, right? But there are fiscal theories as well. And these fiscal theories, that's a kind of inflation targeting. The central bank peg the nominal interest rate at a level consistent to the desired rate of inflation. That's the way it is. So let me recap. In the sense, am I audible? Yeah, let me recap. One is, in the beginning of my lecture, I mentioned about why we need to move away from the deficit financing to purpose-specific deficits. The measurement issues in terms of coverage I mentioned. Budget transparency is crucial over there. Then I have spoken to you about the different schools of thought in which the impact of deficit is discussed, where one school of thought believed that today's deficit is tomorrow's taxes or equal impact on economy, but the Keynesians believe that a timely deficit is good, where the neoclassicals always sit with the stick that says that don't go beyond your 3%, that is going to be growth detrimental to the economy. But we have seen through the empirical evidence that over the years, fiscal discipline was not growth enhancing. If you look at the state budgets, over the years, we over adjusted to fiscal discipline by keeping it to 3% of GDP, our fiscal deficit, at the cost of capital spending. Now, in the conceptual framework using the intertemporal budget constraints, I have explained to you the financing levels, financing modes of the deficit, and each of this, how it is significant, because we need to look into the financing pattern, not only the level of fiscal deficit, and the question whether empirical evidence, whether these are bad, deficit is bad. So we concluded that timely deficit is not bad. Go ahead, but keep the roadmap ready for your excess deficit procedure. Even monetization of deficit, if your R is going greater than G, you can think it as a last resort. And thank you so much. And now I open the floor, and over to you.